All right, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you are here joining us for this event today. My name is Dean Francis, and I'm the president and founder of End Kratom Addiction. Let me just introduce myself to help you also understand how we got here. My son Cameron in 2017 was on the verge of running a sub 4 minute mile in college, his dream that he'd worked so hard for. And he discovered an ad online that suggested that kratom was a plant-based herbal supplement that could help with focus and energy. And he recalls when he first started taking it, he just was blown away by it. He said his studies were more focused. He would take it before a workout, and it definitely energized all the things that it tends to promise people until it didn't. Cameron didn't realize what was happening to him, but his body was building tolerance and eventually dependence. And that led to a huge downward spiral in his life. Eventually dropping out of college, moving back home. He was very depressed. We had him see a counselor, eventually Prozac. But to that point in his life, he had no substance abuse issues at all. He had more friends than I think anyone I've ever met. Life was grand. He was selfless and caring and all those things that you hope to see in your kids and thriving in every possible way. Unfortunately, none of us recognize what kratom actually was until 2021. And so roughly 3.5 years into taking kratom on a daily basis, he was taking the powder form, which you can put into a water bottle and shake it up and drink it just like you would maybe an herbal type supplement. And one particular night, he woke my wife and I up. He felt like he was going to die. We rushed him to the hospital, and very clear to an emergency room physician, that physician took one look at him and recognized Cameron was in a full state of an opioid-like withdrawal. He said to Cameron, "What are you on? You're taking something." And eventually Cameron said, "No, I'm not on drugs. I'm averse," kind of arguing a little bit. And so, "No, you're taking something." He said, "I do. I take this thing called kratom." The doctor didn't know what it was, went back to his computer, looked it up, came back in the room and was pretty emphatic and said, "Kratom is an opioid. You have a full-blown addiction and you need very serious help." Cameron remembers that day. He said, "Dad, I didn't really know what an opioid was at the time." It began a journey for him that for today I'll keep very short. Cameron almost died twice throughout this entire story. It was very dark at times. And as you might know about opioid addiction, the recovery journey, I would say, is probably like getting on your hands and knees and climbing Mount Everest, or at least it can be. It was in Cameron's case. He lost all of his 20s and still not quite himself, but getting there today. Last year, I finally got fed up. I couldn't take it anymore. I had seen too much. I had seen all the harm and damage, and I wanted to do something in my own state, Virginia. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. And so began the process of meeting with any state lawmaker I could find. I don't know anything about lawmaking, have no experience in that. I just wanted to get the word out so the lawmakers could know the truth about what this is. I told them all, and I tell lawmakers this today: we don't tell you what to do. I don't know lawmaking, but I do want you to have the truth so that you can make the right decision for your state or for your country. And long story short, we had tremendous success in that General Assembly session. In our hearings, we completely defeated the industry's voice, the American Kratom Association, that spends unbelievable amounts of money on lobbying and so forth at the state level and the federal level. And our lawmakers generally reached a point where they were like, "Who are these people?" We exposed all the lies, but it allowed them to then make the right decisions for our state at that time. There's still more that are in our state that will be made this next year. That all of a sudden led to our organization, End Kratom Addiction, becoming allied with so many people across the country. It was unbelievable to me. I'll fast forward to today. We have become what I would call central command for the truth about kratom. Our network across the country of addiction medicine specialists and experts, and so many people that have firsthand seen the damage and devastation to people and their families all across the nation. And our job usually is just getting those people in front of you all, in front of lawmakers and their staff members, where you can hear firsthand. These people aren't paid. They're volunteering their time. They've seen it. It's disturbing. and they want to have an impact. And so with that said, I'm going to open here with playing just a short video to put things in perspective of what we're actually talking about, and then come back to you. I'm going to read just a couple things from the FDA's website, and then I'm going to have two people both share their personal stories. It'll be brief, but I want to make sure everybody knows why we're here. This is not just another policy. This is about people's lives and the destruction that is occurring. And again, we are so thankful for you being on this call and taking time to understand more. So Hilary Tesluk is our executive director. Hilary, if you could pull up this video, it is created, we believe, by the American Kratom Association. It's certainly on their YouTube channel, and it is their presentation of Kratom.
You may not have heard of Kratom already, but you probably know someone who benefits from it. So, what is Kratom? Kratom is a safe food that is used by millions of Americans to manage their health and well-being, or as an alternative to coffee to help their mood and focus. Native to Southeast Asia, natural kratom comes from a tropical tree in the coffee family and has been used for centuries in traditional medicines. Kratom has been safely used for decades here in the United States and is becoming increasingly popular because of what it is and what it isn't. Kratom is not a drug, not an opioid, and not a synthetic substance. Americans who are addicted to opioids are turning to Kratom to help them eliminate drug dependency. They say Kratom gives them relief from constant pain, and many say it saved their lives. Natural Kratom is a safe food used by many as an herbal supplement and is used by millions for their health and well-being or for an energy boost. That's why more and more Americans are benefiting from it daily. See if Kratom could help you or someone you know. Visit AmericanKratom.org to learn more.
That is how Kratom is presented by this industry today. I now want to pull up, if I can quick enough, to the FDA website, which I'm not finding as quick as I had hoped. Bear with me just one more moment. If you've not been to the FDA website, you can easily just Google FDA and Kratom. And on that website, what you will read, and I'm just going to let you go there and read it for yourself as you go down. It says very clearly that the FDA says that Kratom is unlawful to market as a dietary supplement, food additive, or a drug. It says, I think multiple times, the FDA warns against the use of Kratom, and it lists all of the adverse effects, including addiction, seizure, liver injury, and death. With that said, I want to turn over to Hilary Tesluk, who has a story just like our son Cameron. She is now the executive director of End Kratom Addiction. I am so impressed with her, so thankful for her. Hilary, let me have you share your story.
Sure. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, my name's Hilary. Like Dean mentioned, I work for End Kratom Addiction, the End executive director, and I would love to share with you all why I do this work today. So my Kratom addiction story began in 2017, and it was introduced to me by a friend. He told me that it was a natural alternative to anxiety medication. And I am someone who lives with trauma and anxiety. At the time, I was taking Xanax to manage those symptoms, and I really wanted to get off of it. And so I decided to give Kratom a try. There was no label on the bag, and so I didn't know how much to take or even what was really in it. But my friend told me to take 4 capsules, and so I did. That was about 2 grams of kratom powder, which is considered a small dose. And it worked. It reduced my anxiety, but it did more than that. It made me feel good. I felt confident, productive, and talkative. And at the time, it felt great. It worked better than Xanax. So I replaced Xanax with kratom. I started taking kratom 3 times a day, just like I did with my anxiety medication, 2 grams at a time for 6 grams of kratom per day. That is still considered quite a low dose of kratom. And so for a few weeks, I was using it in this manner. And I noticed about 3 weeks in that I had to start taking more capsules than I did to get the same effect or to get the same relief. And at the time, too, I was working as a case manager for people who suffer from substance use disorder and mental illness. And because of my education and my experience, I recognized the signs. I knew I was developing a dependence onto kratom. So finally, I look it up and I found out that kratom was a partial opioid agonist. And even though I found out it was an opioid, I still felt like it was okay because it was natural, legal, and I called it a supplement. And so I thought it was okay still. Over time, I went from that very small dose to a very large dose. Within about a year, I was taking 100 capsules of kratom powder per day, which equals 50 grams of kratom powder. So eventually I became severely underweight. I was losing my hair, was falling asleep. I was starting to experience consequences from my use. And so I had to do something, but I didn't know where to go because I didn't know any resources for kratom specifically. But I did what one does when they're addicted to something, and I went to rehab. I went to detox. And so when I got there, nobody knew what kratom was, not even the staff. I had to explain what I was there for. And I only left after 3 days because I felt like I didn't need to be there. People were in there for crack and meth, and I was in there for kratom. And this was back in 2020. And so it was even lesser known at the time. And so I just left. I just left and I went right back to kratom. And I was really stuck for a while. I felt hopeless. I felt like I was the only person in the world suffering from this problem. I was so embarrassed. I was addicted to a vitamin, but I never really gave up. So I kept trying to find help. And eventually I found a Reddit page called Quitting Kratom. And there were tens of thousands of people there describing the same experiences that I was going through. And that helped me realize that I at least wasn't alone, but I still couldn't fully stop kratom. It was very addictive to me. I would quit, relapse, and I was just stuck in the cycle. And so one day I got a message from somebody promoting their virtual kratom recovery meeting, and I had nothing to lose. So I went, even though I didn't really feel like going. And I'm so glad I went because that meeting changed my life. And by that point, I had struggled with severe kratom addiction for about 3 years. And seeing a community of people like me and hearing them share my story, it changed everything for me. And that support helped me finally get clean from kratom for years. And so eventually, I really got involved in service work for kratom addicts, and I helped co-found a place called Quitting Kratom Support. And all we do is provide meetings and resources for people like me who suffer from kratom addiction, because that didn't exist back then, and we needed to fill that gap. And that community grew. It was very successful. Even before synthetic kratom was even a thing, we were a thriving community. And so I thought that with my experience and my knowledge and all the time I had clean and my leadership in Quitting Kratom Support was enough for me to be immune from ever relapsing again, but that wasn't the case. And so I ended up experiencing a couple of tragic losses in my life around the same time. And despite everything I knew, I relapsed on 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is a semi-synthetic kratom, and it's very strong. And when I took 7-0, it felt very similar to kratom. The only difference is it was very intense. It felt like I had taken all 100 capsules of kratom at one time in one tablet. And I know I took 7-0 for only a couple of weeks. I came clean to my community. I told them I needed help, what was going on, and I stepped down from my duties and I went through the withdrawal cold turkey on my own because I didn't want to go back to rehab or detox and experience that. And so it was the worst illness I've ever experienced in my life. It was very traumatic and very bad. But with the help of my community, thank goodness, I was able to get off of it. And ever since then, I have been clean from kratom and 7-0, and there are tens of thousands of people with stories just like mine in that community alone. And so that's why I do this work today, to make sure that our truth is finally being heard. And I thank everyone for listening to my story.
Great. Thank you, Hilary. With that said, we've invited Tia Matlock to be on today. And Tia, I can't even imagine being in your shoes. Tia lost her daughter, Kylie, to an overdose of kratom. And thankfully, Tia has had the courage to share her story publicly to help more people. And so, Tia, we're very thankful you're here.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Tia, and I'm here today because my daughter Kylie cannot be. She died March 1st, 2025. She was only 23 years old. This is not an age where a parent should bury their child. It's not an age where choosing a casket is an option. It's not an age where life with dreams, hopes, and possibilities should come to an end. Kylie was beautiful, passionate, and full of life. She had a smile that could light up a room and a heart that had space for others, even though she was struggling herself. Kylie lived with daily pain from EDS and POTS. She wanted to avoid opiates, so she began her search for natural pain relief. She found kratom. The industry told her it was safe, natural, and similar to coffee. But what they didn't tell her was the primary active compound in kratom, mitragynine, can be dangerous, addictive, and in some cases deadly. Because Kylie was so young, they had to do a full death investigation. After autopsy and toxicology report came back, mitragynine overdose was determined to be the factor of death. Kratom took my daughter's life, not a street drug, but a product sold in gas stations across America. It is often packaged in bright colors and is a product that remains widely available, often presented as harmless and appealing to children. What is especially important for you to know is that Kylie was not a drug user. She did not use synthetics or 7-OH. She was using pure kratom powder. The natural product itself killed her. Today, much of the discussion surrounding kratom focuses on 7-OH. If our goal is to prevent future tragedies, we must recognize that the risks are not limited to enhanced or synthetic products. Kratom products vary in potency. They are often sold with little oversight. Consumers frequently have no idea on how much mitragynine they are taking. These products can lead to dependency, withdrawal, overdose, and death. I could never get Kylie back. I will never hear her laugh again. I'll never get a call. I will never watch her walk down the aisle or hold a grandchild that she may have given me. I could give anything to go back and mourn her, but I can't. But I can ask you to listen. Listen to coroners, toxicologists, law enforcement, emergency room physicians, and the rehab centers. They are seeing consequences firsthand. And please listen to the parents who have buried their children. Kylie was not a number. She was my daughter, a sister and a friend. She deserved the chance to grow and make a difference in this world. No parent should ever have to sit in their child's empty room full of memories and realize they will never walk through that door again. Kylie deserved better. And so do the millions of Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Tia. So thankful for you and prayers for you and your family. As you might imagine, being in my shoes, what eventually occurred was meeting people like Tia, and many of them as parents who have lost their kids. Our son Cameron had two times it almost died. And I got just a little glimpse of that feeling and began to recognize this is enormous. This has been going on for too long. The FDA has warned, it has said these things, but something has to happen. Something has to change. And so with that said, I'm so thankful for our panelists today. These are not only incredibly credentialed and experienced people in their careers, but they have a heart for people and their communities, and they want to speak into this and have impact. And so very thankful for each of them. Dr. Andrew Kolodny, I'll let you get us started.
So thank you, Dean, for organizing this event. And thank you, Hilary and Tia, for sharing your stories and trying to spare others from suffering from the same experiences. I am going to go pretty quickly. I am the medical director for the Opioid Policy Research Collaborative at Brandeis University. Much of my work for the past 20 years has been focused on the opioid crisis. I've worked on the opioid crisis as a physician treating opioid addiction, as a former public health official, as a researcher, and as an advocate. And I've worked with state and federal lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, in their legislative efforts to tackle the opioid crisis. I've testified before the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations on the causes of the North American opioid crisis and potential solutions. I've also worked with state attorney generals in their efforts to take on the opioid industry and the opioid litigation. So I became engaged on the issue of kratom about a year ago. I had just returned to clinical work after taking a break from seeing patients for a few years, and I was just blown away by how all of the patients that I've been treating who had recently become opioid addicted, their opioid addiction began with kratom. It was surprising to me. I contacted colleagues in other settings and really heard that they were experiencing the same thing, and it became clear that we had a new problem involving kratom, or maybe not so new, but it was becoming severe and getting worse quickly. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. As I mentioned, I'm going to begin by explaining that kratom is not simply a botanical substance with opioid-like effects, which is how it's very often characterized, even in the medical literature, as a drug with opioid-like effects. That's really not accurate. It is accurate to say that kratom is an opioid, and I'll explain why that's true. I'm going to talk a little bit about the opioid crisis. Some have argued that kratom is potentially helping the opioid crisis, or I'm going to explain why I don't believe that's the case, why I believe that kratom is actually making the opioid crisis worse. And then lastly, I'm going to go over two studies that I think will really help inform those of you who are involved in policymaking on kratom. These are two studies that have compared different state approaches to the problem and then looked at the public health outcomes. So I've mentioned that kratom is an opioid. To really understand why kratom is an opioid, we have to look at the definition of an opioid. And an opioid is really any drug that binds to the mu opioid receptor and activates the mu opioid receptor. And when you activate a mu opioid receptor, you get an opioid effect. And we have opioids that exist naturally. In opium, which is the sap from the poppy plant, you have natural opioid molecules, which are also called opiates. And the two molecules that you mainly find in opium are codeine and morphine. You can also treat codeine and morphine. You can treat the opium chemically and create stronger versions that get into the brain faster and have a more rewarding effect. That's what's happening when you turn opium into heroin, or when you turn opium into oxycodone or hydromorphone, some of the commonly prescribed prescription opioids. They are semi-synthetic because you've started with something natural. We've heard a lot about 7-hydroxymitragynine. When you see it in this concentrated form, that's also semi-synthetic. It's made from kratom. The kratom industry likes to characterize it as synthetic. They want lawmakers to think it's just made up completely from chemicals. That's not true. It is a kratom-derived product. We do, however, have completely synthetic opioids that you don't need a natural product to make. For example, fentanyl is completely synthetic. Methadone, tramadol, tapentadol, these are all totally synthetic opioids. What they all have in common, they bind to and stimulate the mu opioid receptor and cause an opioid effect. Opium and the poppy plant are not the only places in nature where you find opioids. For example, in the skin of the waxy monkey tree frog is a very potent opioid called dermorphin. The molecule is totally unrelated to other opioids. It's not even an alkaloid, but it's an opioid. It's more potent than morphine, stimulates the opioid receptor. It's an opioid. Kratom contains opioids. The most abundant opioid found in kratom is mitragynine, and mitragynine is an opioid. I'll explain a little bit more about the pharmacology of it in just a moment. Now, if you're doubting me that kratom is an opioid, you could take a look at the leading textbook on kratom and mitragynines, which has in the subtitle, it says the chemistry and pharmacology of opioids from a non-opium source. Kratom is an opioid, but again, if you're still doubting it, you really don't have to go much further than the statement by the Food and Drug Administration, which in 2018 did a study on the receptors that mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine interact with, and then put out the statement that compounds in kratom make it so that it isn't just a plant, it's an opioid. Once you understand that kratom is an opioid, much of what we're seeing, the public health outcomes, the experiences that have been shared by Hilary and Tia, what clinicians are seeing across the country, begins to make a lot more sense. For example, understanding that kratom is an opioid helps explain why some patients who are getting addicted to kratom are winding up on the exact same medicine that's used for treating addiction to heroin and oxycodone and fentanyl. So increasingly, many people with addiction to kratom are winding up on buprenorphine, also called Suboxone. Understanding that kratom is an opioid helps explain why we are seeing an increase in infants born with neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome. It's also called neonatal abstinence syndrome because their mothers used kratom. These are infants who are born with excruciating discomfort. They have a very distinct cry. It is very hard to console them, and often they wind up in the hospital for weeks after delivery, and many are treated with tapering doses of opioids, sometimes methadone, at the beginning of life. And we are seeing an increase in infants born with opioid dependence because of their mother's kratom use, and mothers who in many cases believe they were using a natural non-opioid has been promoted by the kratom industry. You'll sometimes hear the term weak opioid and strong opioid. tramadol and codeine and mitragynine are weak opioids. 7-hydroxymitragynine, fentanyl, oxycodone are considered strong opioids. Generally, opioids that are as strong as morphine or stronger are considered strong opioids. But it's important to understand that the real difference between a weak opioid and a strong opioid is the amount you need to take to get an effect. In other words, if you take a large enough dose of tramadol or codeine or mitragynine, you'll get the same effect as you would from a smaller dose of a stronger opioid. So the fact that an opioid is a weak opioid doesn't mean that it's not addictive. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't produce the same effects. It produces the same effects. You just need to take more of it to get those effects. Let's talk just a little bit about what happens when somebody consumes mitragynine. Mitragynine is itself a weak opioid. It's been studied. Its effects on the opiate receptor have been measured, and it doesn't stimulate the opioid receptor as much as 7-hydroxymitragynine. But when somebody consumes mitragynine and the liver enzymes act on the mitragynine and convert it into 7-hydroxymitragynine. And so the reason that people experience an opioid effect when they take kratom leaf powder, which has generally small amounts of 7-hydroxymitragynine, the opioid effect is actually believed to be largely due to this conversion that happens in the human liver. And I'm specifying here the human liver because this happens in other animals, but not to the same extent. So, for example, mice and rats, they will also convert mitragynine to 7-hydroxymitragynine. Their liver does that too, but much less efficiently. So when you feed, for example, in a study, when you give mitragynine to a mouse or a rat, there's very little 7-hydroxy that forms. Whereas in humans, a substantial portion of the mitragynine is converted to 7-hydroxymitragynine. Why is this important? Why am I telling you this? It's because when you look at the studies that the scientists who are working for the kratom industry like to show and tout over and over again, these are studies that were performed on mice and rats. So when they put up data that they say supports low risk of addiction or low risk of death or respiratory depression, they're looking at studies in animals that don't produce as much 7-hydroxymitragynine as humans do. This is, of course, also really important. This whole topic is important because I think many of you may know that the industry has been working very hard to push a message that there's this bright line between these two molecules, that 7-hydroxymitragynine bad, it should be banned. Mitragynine or kratom leaf products high in mitragynine, good, natural, non-addictive. This is false from a pharmacological perspective, but it's also false from a timeline perspective. What they're arguing doesn't really fit what we've seen with the public health data. The 7-hydroxy products really didn't hit the market until 2023. But if you look at trends in poisoning deaths, if you look at trends in addiction, all of the public health outcomes that we've seen published now, we've seen over the past decade a 1,300% increase in hospitalizations. The mounting public health data on adverse effects, it precedes the emergence of these 7-hydroxy products. So the timeline doesn't fit their narrative either. Certainly the 7-hydroxy products are more dangerous from an overdose perspective. They pack a larger concentrated dose, but the notion that mitragynine or kratom leaf products are safe is false. Let's quickly talk a little bit about the opioid crisis, but how should we really understand the opioid crisis? How should we think about this problem? The accurate way to really frame it is as an epidemic of opioid addiction or opioid use disorder. When you frame it that way, what you're saying is that the reason that the United States has been experiencing record high levels of opioid overdoses, the reason fentanyl flooded into non-urban areas across the United States, the reason we saw a soaring increase in infants born opioid-dependent, outbreaks of injection-related infectious diseases, impact on the workforce, the driver behind all of these health and social problems that we're referring to when we talk about the opioid crisis was a sharp increase in opioid addiction in the United States. A previously rare condition, if you went back 25 years ago, is now very common. About 5% of adults in the United States are suffering from opioid addiction. By 2009, in every state in the country, we had this very large increase in people addicted to prescription opioids, and a sharp increase in a disease over a short period of time is how you would define an epidemic, as consumption of prescription opioids increased, we experienced parallel increases in rates of addiction and in deaths involving prescription opioids. In other words, the epidemic was caused by a sharp increase in prescription opioid consumption. I believe that this is what's happening right now with kratom. I believe that as the United States has experienced a sharp increase in kratom consumption, we are also seeing significant increases in kratom addiction and in poisoning deaths. And the poisoning death data is beginning to come in. The addiction data, we still need better surveillance on, but I believe this is happening right now. And what I think is important for certainly policymakers to understand is that the kratom industry's response to this is identical to the way in which opioid manufacturers responded to this. And they're using some of the same messaging, for example, and some of the same tactics. For example, like the opioid industry, the kratom industry is paying scientists, former regulators, former government officials to spin a message that this might not be happening, and to characterize all of the harm that we're seeing as being limited to drug abusers. The message that Purdue Pharma and other opioid makers pushed was that millions of people are benefiting from prescription opioids that don't really cause addiction, but a subset of our population are drug abusers, and that's where the harms are limited. That's the exact same message that the kratom industry is pushing, and it's why they harp over and over again on the fact that many of the deaths involving kratom are polydrug deaths, which is true, but they're pushing that message because they want policymakers to think that kratom is safe. It's just that there are drug abusers out there misusing this wonderful product. I'm almost done. I just want to quickly go over the two studies I mentioned. For policymakers who are really struggling right now, we do have now two papers recently published done by different groups of researchers, but actually using very similar methodologies. What they did was to compare states that had completely unregulated kratom to states that had regulated kratom using the Kratom Consumer Protection Act to states that had banned kratom to look at outcomes. This was a study, the outcome they looked at was really severe events and hospitalizations involving kratom. The other paper that I'll show you looked at the deaths. In these papers, what they found was that it was only in the states that had banned kratom where there were substantially fewer severe adverse events, that states that had moved in the regulate kratom direction had done no better than states that had completely unregulated kratom. And this was the study that looked at adverse events involving poison center calls. In this study, they looked at deaths using a CDC data set. And for this period of time, for jurisdictions that had reported, there were more than 5,200 deaths that they used in their analysis, and they came to the same conclusion. It was only in states that had banned kratom where there were substantially fewer deaths. And I can tell you because I just recently looked at the data from the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia is a state that went the regulation route. They actually introduced one of the more strict versions of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, limiting the amount of 7-hydroxy mitragynine that could even be in a product, keeping the kratom behind a counter. At least that's been their intention. And despite regulating kratom, Georgia is number one in the country for kratom overdose deaths and number two when you factor in per capita. West Virginia is number one per capita for kratom deaths. So what this data is telling us is that efforts to regulate kratom do not appear to be working anywhere in the country. This was, I believe, one of the statements that we've already discussed, but the FDA has made it clear that these are not approved products and is warning all Americans, and has been doing this since I think at least 2000, not to use kratom. And you'll hear more from other speakers today about that, about the FDA's work on kratom. So I'll stop here. In summary, kratom contains opioids, and in other words, kratom is an opioid. The opioid crisis teaches us that increased use of opioids led to an epidemic of opioid use disorder. This is a lesson we should learn about availability of kratom, and the state policy evidence suggests that it's really only banning kratom that may have a potential impact. Thank you.
Dr. Holstage is here in Virginia from the University of Virginia. Dr. Holstage, I'll let you introduce yourself. Thank you so much for being here.
Dean, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with everybody and this topic that's very important from my perspective as a practicing clinician who takes care of the overdoses. I'm a professor of emergency medicine and pediatrics at the University of Virginia. I came to Virginia in 1999 and I assumed oversight of the Blue Ridge Poison Center. Blue Ridge Poison Center covers half the state for poison center services, and I cover 74 hospitals, everywhere from very populated areas up into Alexandria, Northern Virginia, down to very Southwest Virginia and rural areas. And we're seeing kratom in all these areas. I also created when I came here, the Division of Medical Toxicology. What does that mean? That means at the University of Virginia Health, we actually have a center that cares for patients who are addicted or who have overdosed. And we are the gatekeepers for transfers from the hospitals in our coverage area for coming here and getting care in the intensive care units, our floors, and our emergency department. And such as today, I'm on call, we'll make determinations as to how we care for these patients, and we help our clinicians at the other hospitals in managing these patients. And then finally, in 2013, because of the credible threat of substances that were entering society, I assumed leadership of our Department of Student Health and Wellness. And this is on the wave of bath salts, the synthetic cathinones, and the synthetic cannabinoids, K2 and spice that came out at that time, and care for our student population at the University of Virginia, looking at doing best practices. And we have seen kratom in our addiction services, in our overdoses, in the intensive care units on life support, and in our student population, including with addiction. There's a study that we published just recently that took a look at America's poison centers, the data, which is the National Poison Data System. There's 53 poison centers in the United States. Each poison center submits de-identified data. In other words, when calls come into our poison center, it is de-identified and it gets uploaded every 5 minutes to a national database that then works with federal entities and doing surveillance. And when we start to see upticks in certain areas, such as overdoses with kratom, that starts to put out warnings. And there's public service announcements, there's talk that we do in the communities about warnings and things that we're seeing with products that start to emerge. The study that we did was published in MMWR in March of 26. And what we looked at were the trends. So our aim was to characterize the trends in kratom-related poison center exposures over an 11-year time period by exposure type, single substance or multiple substances, meaning that it was not just kratom but another substance, demographics, sex and age, as well as clinical outcome. We looked at the National Poison Data System. We looked at the population greater than 12 years of age. We separated it into age groups, and we looked at the hospitalizations, critical care, non-critical care, psychiatric, serious medical outcomes, as well as other data associated with those overdoses. What we found over 11 years, there was an increase of 1,200% compared over that time period. In other words, there's been a rapid rise in the calls to poison centers regarding kratom and kratom products. Most reports involve males and young adults ages 20 to 39, but the reports among adults age 40 to 59 have increased most sharply, with rates nearly overlapping with those in the young adults. Single substance exposure reports accounted for most reports. Multiple substances were associated with more hospitalizations, serious outcomes, and the vast majority of the deaths, but realized single substances were associated with those also. If you look at that data, this is showing the rise of the calls to the poison centers, giving us some idea of what is the prevalence in society. This shows single versus multiple substances, both the frequency, the number of exposures, and the rate of what we saw. And you can see the steep rise that has occurred, but certainly has been a steady rise over the last decade. And this gets into the male versus female on the left to give an example of sex, but the age group look at also. There's been an increase in each age group, including the age group of 12 to 19 years of age. So it is not just those over 21 who are getting their hands on these products. And that's certainly true in my practice too, and including with the collegiate and high school populations that I'm dealing with. If you look at hospitalizations and serious medical outcomes, single substance and multiple substance are both associated with them. In my own clinical practice, I have intubated and been involved with kratom overdoses that have been on life support. And tremendous concerns as we see this growing in our population in our addiction clinics as well as in our hospitals as these cases continue to increase. We're also seeing combined products, and this is fairly new. Products such as Feel Free, Convada. These products that you see on the left were bought across the street from what we call grounds at the University of Virginia, our campus. These are readily available to our student population. They can also buy these easily online. But today I pulled off K-Bomb Kratom. You can buy the product, have it delivered directly to your house. A combination product of kava, which has effects that are similar to a benzodiazepine like Valium, combined with kratom in a product, and these are being touted as alcohol substitutes to the youth. We did a study on this too, looking at kava and kratom reports, and kava exposures declined sharply after 2002. It was associated with liver injury, and there are FDA warnings that came out regarding that. And there's been a steady increase in kava drinks that have occurred. But what was really interesting is finding that the kava kratom combination actually was reported with much more severe neurologic effects, including sedation, coma, seizures. So certainly the product combination between the two of them seems to be the most problematic. We talked earlier about metabolism, and I want to highlight this just a little bit more for those of you who are involved in the laws. One of the problems we have, I at the University of Virginia can actually detect mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, pseudoindoxyl. I have a phenomenal pathology lab and toxicology lab that has worked to develop these methods. The other 74 hospitals can't detect these. And I can't be clear enough, this is really problematic because it skews the data that's out there, meaning that the reports we have are based purely on clinical, but we cannot do analytics on these unless there are deaths. That goes to forensics. And even that goes out to highly specialized labs in the country. The other thing is that we're finding, and we're doing research on this currently, is 7-hydroxymitragynine is not stable in serum because it gets metabolized in the serum to pseudoindoxyl. That means even under refrigeration, we're finding it is being metabolized and the levels will drop. So if there is a death and that body is not found for some time, the potential for 7-hydroxymitragynine to be metabolized and gone by the time they do analytics is a possibility based on what we're finding. And so I have a tremendous concern regarding the analytics. Examples of products, you can buy the kratom directly. You can get tablets like 7 tabs, one of my first overdoses that I intubated here at the University of Virginia. And now we're seeing pseudoindoxyl, a more potent opioid that is hitting the market and is across the street from my campus. And it's not acceptable from my standpoint. Now we also have MGM-15. This just came out in a report. The Drug Threat Analysis Group put this out. We actually just bought this to try and be able to do analytics on this. This product you can buy, and you can see a number of things and resources here that I just pulled off the web today, where I can have this directly delivered to my house. That is also a potent opioid and a new semi-synthetic derivative of this product. And I'm going to finish up with this report. 2013, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime published the World Drug Report. This is on the following up to what we saw with new synthetics coming out, what really led to a wake-up call for us when we saw the bath salts, K2 spice hitting the market. And they report, while new harmful substances have been emerging with unfailing regularity of the drug scene, the international drug control system is floundering for the first time under the speed and creativity of the phenomenon known as new psychoactive substances. MPS are substances of abuse, either in pure form or in preparation, that are not controlled by the international drug conventions, but which may pose a public health threat. In this context, the term new does not necessarily refer to new inventions, but to substances that have newly become available in specific markets. In general, MPS is an umbrella term for unregulated psychoactive substances or products intended to mimic the effects of controlled drugs. And I'm going to put out there that kratom and its offshoots, 7-hydroxymitragynine, pseudoindoxyl, and now MGM-15, absolutely fall under this and are too reminiscent of times past when we've had to work hard with our politicians to try and get these off and keep our communities safe. So be aware, this is certainly very real to us at the University of Virginia. We're seeing multiple overdoses. It's in our addiction clinics, and it's truly problematic. I really appreciate, Dean, you're letting me speak today, and certainly the speakers here today also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holstedge. We're now going to go to Dr. Michael Sucher from Arizona. Michael is recognized nationally, but certainly is among the absolute top addiction physicians in the state of Arizona. And so, Dr. Such, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Michael Sucher. I've been practicing addiction medicine primarily in Arizona for over 30 years. I have a number of roles that place me squarely in the center of this issue. I'm the medical director of the largest opioid treatment program network in Arizona. We have 25 clinics and approximately 10,000 patients with opioid use disorder. I'm also the program director for the largest and first addiction medicine fellowship training program, where we train physicians from other specialties in addiction medicine. And I have spent much of my career taking care of physicians and other health professionals who have dealt with substance use disorders. At our methadone clinics, our opioid treatment programs, over the last year and a half, we have started to see an increasing number of patients presenting with kratom addiction. And you've already heard from other speakers a lot about what kratom is, and kratom is unquestionably an opioid. It produces addiction. It produces withdrawal. People overdose on it. And as you've heard, some people die. And Tia, I am so sorry about your loss. Just a terrible thing. And and it's available everywhere. We actually did a TV spot about a month ago for one of the local TV stations, and one of our clinic managers prior to that just walked across the street to a smoke shop and walked back with multiple preparations that he purchased legally, inexpensively, to just demonstrate how easy it is to obtain this. And I've seen this in so many patients. I have a longtime woman friend in recovery from opioid use disorder. She discovered Feel Free, which you saw a photo the other day. She thought it was a natural supplement, tried it, and immediately got high, reminded her of being on opioids, and had a serious reaction to it. As I mentioned, I treat a lot of physicians. There's a physician in long-term recovery from opioid use disorder. He discovered kratom, thought it was safe, natural, non-addictive, and also relapsed essentially on kratom, becoming addicted to it. And he told me, I just saw him the other day, and he said it was far more difficult to get off of kratom than it was. And you've seen and heard about Hilary's struggle with this. So it's absolutely true how difficult that is. Another gentleman was at his local gym, and somebody introduced him to kratom at the gym. He became addicted very quickly, and ordering cases of it online. Has just now gone through detox and treatment to finally get off this, which has been a problem. You also heard from our last speaker that not all drug tests detect kratom. In fact, most drug tests do not detect kratom. I've done a lot of work with drug testing over the years, and we have a sort of a maxim: if you don't look for a particular drug, you will not find it. So we need to also do something about this. Additionally, we also know from our own treatment experience at our clinics that buprenorphine or Suboxone and methadone are effective treatments for kratom use disorder. This drug should not be available for children, teenagers, or even adults. It should not be allowed to be purchased. We heard about synthetic drugs. 7-OH is 10 times more potent than morphine. And you've heard about how potent fentanyl is. And what's interesting, my partner in practice years ago, when OxyContin became available and touted as the safe, non-addictive, effective pain reliever, we looked at each other and said, this is not going to end well. And it's amazing how prescient we turned out to be, because clearly we recognized this opioid epidemic long before the general public became aware. And I think we've seen that progress from pain pills, if you will, to fentanyl, now widely available. Years ago, fentanyl was only seen in anesthesiologists who had access to it in the operating room. They were the only ones we ever saw with fentanyl addiction. And now kratom here is just available over the counter. And history is replete with drugs that were supposedly safe, natural. Natural? Cocaine is natural. Opium is natural. That doesn't make either of those non-addictive or safe. Meperidine or Demerol was synthesized in 1935 as the new effective pain reliever that was non-addictive and safer than morphine. That didn't turn out very well. Years later, Tramadol came on the market. Safe, effective, non-addictive pain medication. Turns out It's an opioid too. And it took a long time for that drug to be controlled by the Drug Enforcement Administration as a scheduled medication. I just think you've heard some very good information from everybody before me, and hopefully this will move the needle because it will take legislation at the state and national level to get the right result and protect our citizens and particularly our children.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sucher. And so today is aimed at U.S. lawmakers and their staff. And just to give you a little context, because there has not been action at the federal level. Actually, it was attempted twice in 2016 and 18, and both times sabotaged quite candidly by the industry. But this has been a state level issue where states have to then figure this out. And so today, what you're experiencing is what states have begun experiencing in the last couple of years, being able to hear directly from people who are treating those who have been addicted, have seen the overdoses, and then in the state levels, being able, once they recognize it, being able to take the appropriate action. I'm so thankful for Michael Templeton, his experience as a special agent at the DEA over 25 years has been priceless to help everybody get the right perspective on this. And so, Michael Templeton, I'll turn this over to you.
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be here with you today. So, yes, I'm a recently retired DEA special agent for the past 25 years. I worked in both domestic offices and overseas. Started my career with DEA in 1997, so I've seen every epidemic that came along with the crack cocaine epidemic, the methamphetamine epidemic, and then the other substances that I'll talk about in a minute that have come through our convenience stores. I've also worked overseas. I spent 2 years in Pakistan and 2.5 years in Afghanistan, where I finished my career out right before the country collapsed. So my job in Afghanistan, obviously, is why is DEA were they in Afghanistan? Is Afghanistan's the world's largest producer of opium. So our job there was to work with host nation counterparts and to prohibit the opium and then the conversion of opium into morphine and heroin to enter the world market, and also to prohibit those funds to be used by terrorists, including ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda and Taliban, to fund their war against our troops. So kratom, 95% of it comes from the island of Borneo in the country of Indonesia. Prior to kratom starting to be grown commercially, the main commercial product in Borneo was rubber trees. And then kratom was not introduced, it's always been there, but the world market came to them, the U.S. market. Some people came over there and said there's a market for this and convinced them to set up a exportation apparatus to the United States and other parts of the world. What's important to know about Indonesia is that the country itself, their health ministry, which would be similar to our FDA, prohibits the kratom, any part of the kratom plant, to be put in any dietary supplements, food or drinks in the country of Indonesia. However, they do allow the exportation of the same to the United States. So they've chosen macroeconomics and profit over the health and well-being of the world populace, including the United States, whereas they're protecting their own people from kratom being put in their own products. Their equivalent, the Indonesian equivalent of the DEA, their Narcotics Bureau, are calling for it to be Schedule 1. So they're in conflict with each other. So you have their equivalent of the FDA, their equivalent of the DEA in Indonesia, in conflict with the executive branch. So the executive branch has chosen profit and money over the health and well-being of the rest of the world while trying to protect, in some sense, their own populace. So how does it get into the United States? Let's talk about the sheer volume that's being produced. So when I was in Afghanistan at the height of the war, typically 4,500 metric tons of opium were produced per year in Afghanistan. To put that in perspective with kratom, just in the island of Borneo alone, they produce upwards of 4,500 metric tons of kratom per month. A large portion of that goes to the United States. Some goes to Europe and other places. A lot of European countries have banned kratom. So it is processed. They pick the leaves, they devein the leaf, they grind it, they run it through a mesh. They have this lab, they call it a lab, that they set up in a town in the eastern part of Borneo, which supposedly tests products samples products for salmonella, metal, and all those things. And then it is put on smaller vessels because they don't have a deep water port in Borneo to supply the world with their kratom. So they use smaller vessels and they'll bring it over to the port in Jakarta, or they'll bring it over to another port in Indonesia, or they'll bring it over to a port close to them in another country. And then from there, it goes out in 20-foot and 40-foot containers throughout the world and into the United States. The United States receives 1.3 million 20-foot and 40-foot containers. And out of that 1.3 million, about 100 of those will contain kratom. So the difficulty to even find the kratom is just by the sheer mass of volume of containers that are coming into the United States. It's also the fact that there's a gray area. Some perceive it as a gray area. Certainly the kratom market does. I don't. The FDA put out an import alert, which states that U.S. Customs and Border Protection can seize without inspection any kratom products which are designated for food or dietary supplements. So if they can identify a shipping container, and if the importer has designated as kratom and for dietary or food supplements, they can seize it without inspection and get a hold of the importer and say, you can pay for the destruction of it, or you can pay to ship it back to wherever it came from. The problem is these kratom the companies are mislabeling the import records. They're not stating that it's for dietary or food consumption. They're calling it botanicals or for gardening. And in effect, what they've done is they've defrauded the United States. They've lied on their import records in order to get those kratom shipments to come through. In doing so, they've committed multiple felonies, which I'm not going to list to you today, but there's multiple United States code that they violated. The money that they're sending to Indonesia from U.S. banks is money laundering because they have the underlying criminal charge of defrauding the United States, lying on import records, or introducing the product into the food or dietary supplement market in the United States. They've committed an underlying offense, and then any money sent overseas to pay for the underlying offense is money laundering. So I'm going to give you what was told to me by an Indonesian kratom supplier. So I was contacted on LinkedIn by an Indonesian kratom supplier, and he was offering me, and he explained to me how much kratom is in one shipping container. So one 40-foot shipping container, and remember, 100 of those are coming into the United States per month, will contain 27 metric tons of kratom powder, big 40-pound sacks of green kratom powder. And he was going to charge me $5.50 per kilogram in order to import that product. And his advertising on LinkedIn states that the kratom acts like an opiate. He didn't even say opioid. He said it acts like an opiate and will get you high and will help you study and relax. That's coming from the supplier in Indonesia. And that's just one supplier. There's multiple that I could communicate with, and they're trying to pitch the same message in order to get people to buy these things. So that's that. Everything's illegal. Every gram of kratom coming into the United States is come through by luck or by fraud. By luck is 1.3 million containers are coming into the ports of the United States every month, and only 100 can contain kratom. So if the U.S. Customs and Border algorithm at their National Targeting Center cargo don't pick up on keywords, they don't even know those containers are coming through. They don't even know to even look to whether or not the import record states for human consumption or for dietary. They're just getting through. Now, let's say that a kratom supplier told the truth on their import records and said, this is kratom and we're going to put it in a drink and we're going to bring it in the United States. We're going to distribute it all over the United States. And it gets through by luck. They've still committed a misdemeanor if they indeed follow through and put that kratom in dietary supplements or drinks and put it into the United States. They can face fines, but it's certainly not a felony like everything else. So that's basically how it's getting through. And I'll close with this. As I stated, I've seen everything that came through as a DEA agent for 25 years, and before that, a police officer. The first thing to hit the gas station market, late 80s, was ephedrine. They called them yellow jackets. They were called gas station speed. Ultimately, the federal government regulated that, and as you know it now, you have to show your ID at a pharmacy to get pseudoephedrine, which is a nasal decongestant. They did that because people were making methamphetamine from it. Then came along synthetic cathinols known as spice. So spice was a ground up plant material and they sprayed synthetics on it and people were smoking it. That was in gas stations, ultimately Scheduled 1. Then came along bath salts, which was called Flocka, which caused a lot of problems, particularly in South Florida, with erratic behavior and deaths, and a lot of issues with that. That was sold in gas stations. Then it was Scheduled 1. Now it comes along Kratom. And even before all that, gas stations have always had crack pipes and meth pipes in their gas stations. This started in the mid-'80s. And you can still go to a gas station today, and at the point of sale, there'll be a little glass 4-inch tube with a plastic rose in it, or it'll be a straight, instead of a straight tube, it'll have a bulb on the end of it with a hole, which is a meth pipe, and have a rose in it. The Chinese manufacturers put those roses in those glass containers in order to get through U.S. Customs to say they're a novelty item as opposed to a piece of drug paraphernalia. Introduction of drug paraphernalia into the United States is against the law. It's against Title 21. It's a felony. I've worked on it. I've worked with U.S. Customs and cracked open containers at the Port of New York and seized 1 million of these things. The problem is there's a lack of attention on these gas stations that have absolutely brought a lot of havoc on the United States for over 20 years or over 30 years, and they're continuing to do. So I would implore everyone to do your homework, listen to both sides, make sound judgments, and be on the right side of history on this one. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to close today with the policy statement from the American Medical Association, simply because I think it really captures the sentiment that everyone really has. They wrote it in 2023, and I'm a good faith person. If you tell me that somehow Kratom has been great for your chronic pain or some other, that's terrific. At the same time, when I hear those stories, I'm kind of like, you're describing an opioid. And the idea of selling an opioid in a gas station or just online and widely available doesn't make any sense to me. And so the American Medical Association simply said there should be a ban on all over-the-counter sales. They basically were acknowledging having something like this that is not gone through any rigorous safety testing, widely available, is just not appropriate. And they simply state that it needs to go through they're not trying to pass any judgment. They're just simply trying to say it needs to go through the appropriate rigorous safety testing. And then when it comes to market, it comes through the appropriate regulatory system and medical oversight and things like that. And if that can happen, that's terrific. But what we have today is an absolute nightmare. People's lives are being devastated every single day. And so we thank you so much for being here. We are going to continue to be available to you. Anything that we can do to be supportive and helpful in U.S. lawmaking, we would love to do that. And again, to our panelists and to Tia in particular, we're so thankful for you spending time here with us today. Thank you, everybody. Hilary, any questions left that we need to address?
It's been addressed. I really liked the point that Amy brought up. She asked, how are states with a full ban supporting those who are already using addicted to Kratom when the ban is implemented? Pushback she's hearing against the full ban include putting people into withdrawal and removing access to the whole leaf product that people are using for perceived therapeutic benefit. And so Dr. Kalani had a great answer to that. I didn't know this about Connecticut. It rolled out its ban along with disseminating existing substance use treatment resources and helplines. Treatment for Kratom is same as other opioids. Access to opioid use disorder treatment can be improved everywhere, but in most states does exist. Kratom addiction treatment expansion is a good use of opioid litigation funds. I would have to agree. And that, in my opinion, we're behind on that in terms of support for Kratom specifically.
Yes, and I just want to remind everybody, there is such a thing called kratomquitters.com that Hilary helped co-found, and they are having tremendous success with people that plug into that recovery community. And so certainly in other cases, there is the medical need to get through this, but there's a recovery community that is outstanding that can also be a part of those solutions. Thank you. Dr. Holstead, do you want to make any final comments since we still got you here after kind of taking all this in today?
Oh, Dean, I really appreciate being on this. I'm with the other presenters too, and certainly it's escalating. And I think the data that we have from multiple sources, so this problem is escalating and very rapidly. And certainly we need to have action that occurs on this. So I really appreciate being on with you, and I appreciate the invite.
Again, thank you, everyone. So glad you were here. Feel free to reach out love to support in any way that we can. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.